250 years ago, a bold idea changed the course of history forever. A handful of colonies dared to challenge the world's most powerful empire. Against impossible odds, they fought for freedom, independence, and a dream that would inspire generations. Today, as America celebrates its 250th anniversary, we're looking back at the extraordinary journey that transformed 13 small colonies into one of the most influential nations on Earth. This is the incredible story of the United States, from revolution to global superpower. Long before the United States existed, the eastern coast of North America was home to 13 British colonies. Stretching from New Hampshire in the north to Georgia in the south, these settlements were growing rapidly. Farmers cultivated tobacco, rice, wheat, and corn. Merchants filled bustling ports with goods arriving from Europe, the Caribbean, and Africa. Families built communities, churches, schools, and businesses, believing they were loyal subjects of the British Crown. But life wasn't equal for everyone. Wealthy landowners prospered while many struggled to survive. Enslaved Africans were forced into brutal labor, especially on southern plantations, forming a tragic part of the colony's economy. Native American nations faced increasing pressure as settlers expanded westward onto their ancestral lands. For many years, the colonies enjoyed a surprising amount of self-government. Local assemblies made many day-to-day decisions, and colonists grew accustomed to managing their own affairs. Yet thousands of miles away in London, the British government was beginning to see the colonies less as partners, and more as a source of revenue. No one could imagine that within a few years, ordinary farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, or merchants would find themselves at the center of a revolution that would reshape the world forever. By the early 1760s, Britain had emerged victorious from the French and Indian War, a brutal conflict fought across North America. The victory gave Britain control over vast new territories, but it came at an enormous cost. The war had left the British government buried in debt, and officials in London believed the American colonies should help pay the bill. To many British leaders, the solution seemed simple: raise taxes on the colonies. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, requiring colonists to pay taxes on newspapers, legal documents, licenses, and even playing cards. Soon came more taxes on glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea. But the colonists saw things very differently. They had no representatives in the British Parliament, yet they were being taxed by lawmakers thousands of miles away. Their rallying cry spread from town to town: no taxation without representation. What began as frustration quickly grew into organized resistance. Merchants boycotted British goods. Secret groups like the Sons of Liberty organized protests. Crowds gathered in streets, demanding justice. The relationship between Britain and its colonies was no longer built on trust. It was becoming a battle over rights, freedom, and who truly held power. The spark of revolution had been lit, and there was no turning back. Then, on a cold December night in 1773, a group of ordinary colonists disguised themselves in the darkness, and committed an act that shocked the British Empire. By 1773, tensions between Britain and the American colonies had reached a breaking point. The British Parliament passed the Tea Act, giving the British East India Company the exclusive right to sell tea directly in the colonies. Although the tea was actually cheaper, colonists saw something far more dangerous. It was another attempt to force them to accept taxation without representation. On the evening of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists gathered quietly in Boston. Many disguised themselves as Mohawk warriors, not to mock Native Americans, but to hide their identities from British authorities. Under the cover of darkness, they marched toward 3 British ships anchored in Boston Harbor. Without harming a single crew member or stealing any cargo, the protesters worked with remarkable discipline. One by one, they broke open hundreds of wooden chests and dumped more than 300 crates of tea into the icy harbor. By sunrise, the water was stained with floating tea leaves, and one of the boldest acts of protest in American history was complete. News of the Boston Tea Party spread across the Atlantic. In London, British leaders were furious. They responded with harsh new laws, closing Boston Harbor and punishing Massachusetts. Instead of crushing the resistance, these actions united the colonies even more. The path toward revolution had become almost impossible to stop. Britain answered the Boston Tea Party with punishment. But in the spring of 1775, a single gunshot on a quiet village green would ignite a full-scale war, and change the world forever. By the spring of 1775, Massachusetts was on the edge of open rebellion. British troops were stationed in Boston, while thousands of colonial militia members were preparing for a confrontation. On the night of April 18, British soldiers marched out of Boston under orders to seize colonial military supplies in Concord. But the colonists were ready. Writers including Paul Revere warned communities that the British were coming. Before sunrise on April 19, British regulars reached Lexington. Waiting for them was a small group of colonial militia on the village green. No one knows for certain who fired the first shot. But suddenly, gunfire erupted. The militia scattered, leaving several men dead. The British continued toward Concord, but their mission was no longer a secret. At Concord's North Bridge, colonial militia confronted the British again. This time, the Americans fired back. The British began their long retreat toward Boston, facing attacks from colonial fighters along the road. By the end of the day, dozens of British and colonial soldiers were dead. The confrontation had transformed political resistance into armed rebellion. The American Revolution had begun. The fighting had begun, but the colonies still faced the most powerful military empire on earth. And now, they needed an army, and a leader. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, the rebellion was no longer just a protest. It was a war. Thousands of colonial militia gathered around Boston, but they were not yet a unified American army. The colonies needed someone who could bring these separate forces together. That leader would be George Washington. A wealthy Virginia planter and experienced military officer, Washington was chosen by the Continental Congress to command the new Continental Army. He accepted the responsibility knowing exactly what he was facing. Britain possessed a powerful professional military, a massive navy, and enormous resources. Washington arrived outside Boston in July of 1775 and took command of thousands of soldiers. But the army faced shortages of weapons, ammunition, food, clothing, and training. Many of the men had little or no military experience. Still, Washington understood something important. The Americans didn't necessarily have to defeat Britain in every battle. They simply had to survive long enough to keep the revolution alive. And over the years that followed, Washington's determination would be tested again and again. The American Revolution was about to become a long, brutal struggle for independence. But while Washington was building an army outside Boston, another battle was about to prove just how difficult defeating Britain would be. In June of 1775, the revolutionaries faced a terrifying question: could ordinary colonial soldiers actually stand against the British army? The answer came on the hills overlooking Boston. On the night of June 16, colonial forces secretly moved onto Breed's Hill, near Bunker Hill. Under the command of Colonel William Prescott, they worked through the darkness, building defensive fortifications while the British watched from across the harbour. By morning, British commanders realised what had happened. Their response was immediate. Thousands of British troops marched toward the American position. Their objective was simple: capture the hill and drive the colonists away. As the British advanced, the American defenders waited behind their earthworks. Their ammunition was limited, and they had little chance of defeating the British in a prolonged battle. Then came the order to fire. The first British attack was met with devastating musket fire. British soldiers fell across the hillside, and the assault collapsed. A second attack followed. Again, the Americans held their ground. Finally, the British attacked a third time. This time, the colonial defenders were running dangerously low on ammunition. The British broke through, forcing the Americans to retreat. The colonists had lost the battle, but they had delivered a shocking message: Britain would not crush this rebellion easily. The revolution had become a war Britain could no longer ignore. The Americans had shown they could fight. But winning a war was another matter entirely. Across the Atlantic, Britain was preparing to send an overwhelming force, and soon, the revolutionaries would face their greatest crisis yet. By the summer of 1776, the conflict with Britain had changed completely. What had begun as a protest against taxes was now a full-scale war. Across the colonies, a growing number of leaders believed that reconciliation with Britain was no longer possible. They wanted something far more radical: independence. In Philadelphia, delegates to the Continental Congress debated one of the most important decisions in American history. On June 11, a committee chose a young Virginia delegate named Thomas Jefferson to draft a declaration explaining why the colonies should become independent. Jefferson worked in a rented room, writing and rewriting his words. His draft was then debated, edited, and revised by Congress. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence. Its message was revolutionary. Governments existed to protect certain fundamental rights, and when a government violated those rights, people had the power to change it. The declaration did not instantly create a peaceful nation. The war was still raging, and independence would have to be defended on the battlefield. But the words written on that parchment transformed the meaning of the revolution. The colonies were no longer simply fighting against British policies. They were claiming to become a new country, the United States of America. But declaring independence was one thing. Defending it against the most powerful empire on earth was something else entirely. The Declaration of Independence had announced a new nation, but Britain had no intention of simply letting the colonies walk away. In the summer of 1776, British forces launched a massive campaign to crush the revolution. Their first major target was New York. Washington's army faced an enemy that was larger, better trained, and better supplied. When the British attacked Long Island, American forces were overwhelmed. Washington's army was forced to retreat. Over the following months, the Americans lost New York City and suffered a series of defeats. Soldiers deserted. Supplies were running low. The army's future looked uncertain. By December, Washington knew that something had to change. He needed a victory, not just for the battlefield, but for the survival of the revolution itself. Then came Christmas night. Washington and his exhausted soldiers crossed the icy Delaware River in darkness. On the other side waited thousands of Hessian troops fighting for Britain. Before dawn on December 26, the Americans attacked Trenton. The surprise was devastating. The Continental Army captured prisoners, weapons, and supplies while suffering remarkably few losses. It wasn't a war-winning victory, but it gave the revolution something desperately needed: hope. And Washington wasn't finished yet. Trenton gave the revolution hope. But the war was far from over. Across the Atlantic, America's struggle was attracting a powerful new ally, and that alliance would change the course of the war. Washington's victory at Trenton had given the American cause new life. But Britain still possessed a powerful army and the world's strongest navy. The revolutionaries needed something they didn't have: a powerful ally. That ally was France. France had its own reasons for opposing Britain. The two nations had been bitter rivals for generations, and French leaders saw the American Revolution as an opportunity to weaken their greatest enemy. At first, France secretly supplied the Americans with weapons, ammunition, uniforms, and other military supplies. But after the American victory at Saratoga in 1777, France decided to take a much bigger risk. In 1778, France formally entered the war on the American side. French troops and warships joined the fight. Suddenly, Britain wasn't fighting just rebellious colonies. It was facing an international conflict. French naval power would become especially important. British forces could no longer move troops and supplies around the Atlantic without facing a serious threat. The alliance didn't guarantee American victory, but it dramatically changed the balance of power. And eventually, American and French forces would converge on one final battlefield in Virginia, where Britain's hopes of crushing the revolution would begin to collapse. With France now committed to the fight, the balance was shifting. But the war still had to be won on American soil. And in 1781, American and French forces would surround a British army in Virginia, leading to the battle that effectively ended the revolution. By 1781, the American Revolution had entered its final and most dramatic chapter. British forces under General Charles Cornwallis had established a position at Yorktown, Virginia, hoping to maintain control of the southern colonies. But Washington saw an opportunity. American and French forces began moving south toward Yorktown. At the same time, a powerful French fleet sailed into the Chesapeake Bay, blocking the British from receiving reinforcements or escaping by sea. Thousands of American and French soldiers surrounded Cornwallis's army. Then the bombardment began. American and French artillery pounded British positions day after day. Under cover of darkness, Allied troops moved closer, capturing key defensive positions and tightening the siege. By October, Cornwallis's army was trapped. His supplies were running out, his defenses were collapsing, and there was no clear path to escape. On October 19, 1781, British troops marched out and surrendered at Yorktown. The war would not officially end that day, but Yorktown destroyed Britain's ability and political will to continue the conflict on the same scale. After years of fighting, the American Revolution had reached its decisive turning point. The dream of independence was finally within reach. The guns of Yorktown had fallen silent. But independence still had to be negotiated, recognized, and written into history. After 8 years of war, the United States was about to become a nation recognized by the world. The surrender at Yorktown marked the collapse of Britain's final major military campaign in America. But the Revolutionary War was not officially over. Across the Atlantic, leaders in Britain faced growing pressure. The war had become costly, unpopular, and increasingly impossible to win. After years of fighting, both sides agreed that it was time to negotiate peace. In 1783, representatives of the United States and Great Britain met in Paris, France. Among the American negotiators were Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and John Adams. Their mission was clear: secure international recognition of American independence. On September 3, 1783, both nations signed the Treaty of Paris. The treaty officially ended the Revolutionary War. Britain formally recognized the United States as a free, sovereign, and independent nation. The agreement also established America's borders, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean in the east to the Mississippi River in the west. It granted fishing rights off the coast of Canada and called for the withdrawal of British troops from American territory. After 8 long years of sacrifice, courage, and determination, the dream that had begun with 13 colonies had become reality. The United States of America had earned its place among the nations of the world. But building a country would prove to be just as difficult as winning one. A new chapter in American history was only beginning. From 13 small colonies to a nation that would shape the modern world, America's first 250 years have been filled with extraordinary courage, innovation, sacrifice, triumph, and challenge. The story of the United States continues to evolve, and the next chapter is still being written. If you enjoyed this journey through history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us on Storyscope for more cinematic documentaries that bring the past to life. Until next time, thanks for watching.